Here with Rick McDowell and Bert Sachs, and I'd like to start by asking you what brings you here to this Ground Zero retreat.
It's really just a desire to make the world a better world.
And what projects are you doing to try and make the world a better world?
My main project actually is connected with Iraq. I was there last November with a group that Rick led into Iraq, 4 Americans. We brought $10,000 worth of medicines to the country, and the reason that we went was because of our knowledge that something of the order of 500,000 children and over 1 million civilians have died in that country as a result of a lack of food, lack of medicine, lack of clean drinking water. When you hear the phrase destroyed infrastructure, it's important to connect that with some reality, and what that means is that the municipal drinking water facilities, the pumping stations, the sewage processing stations, many of them have been destroyed and the country can't rebuild them because of the economic sanctions, which are the most stringent sanctions ever imposed in recent times on a country that used to import 70% of its food and medicine. So it's our desire to call attention to this and to raise the issue, because very simply, if 1 million civilians died because of bombing during the war, that would raise an immediate outrage in the world. And yet 1 million civilians have died because of a siege on a country where they can't get food and medicine, and it's gone by largely unnoticed. And it can't be less wrong to starve people to death than it is to bomb them to death. And these are civilians.
What has the reactions been from other countries about these sanctions?
My sense is that the Europeans are more aware of this and more knowledgeable and more upset than Americans are. Perhaps their press has given them more information about it. And it's described, I've read an article, it was published in the Seattle Times a while ago, about pressure on the United States coming from European countries because of this. It can be attributed to economic reasons, which may be a factor as well, in that companies in other countries want to have or had arrangements with Iraq. But then one can also attribute, sadly, economic reasons for our desire to continue sanctions on Iraq, just with this immense humanitarian toll that it's taking, because of our desire to divert the $15 or $20 billion in oil sales to Saudi Arabia away from Iraq, because Saudi Arabia will purchase F-15 fighter planes from us and continue to help pay for the Gulf War. So they're economic, sadly, rather harsh ones behind the reality of the situation as well.
And how do you hope to bring out more information to the American public about this?
One way is to simply go there and to come back and be a witness and to speak of this. About once a month now since I've been back, I've had a speaking opportunity largely at churches. This coming Sunday, a week from tomorrow actually, I'm going to be speaking at a church in Port Townsend. And to let people know, I think the major task we have is one of information. And virtually nobody in the country, I can't believe that 10% of the people in the country know about this, probably much less. That the amount of deaths, if you compare it with Bosnia, for example, in Bosnia, the number of casualties, number of deaths from all of the sides, from all of the fighting, soldiers and civilians, I've read is something like 250,000 people. You can't know the numbers exactly. But to think that 4 times that number of people have died in Iraq and almost nobody knows about it means that we're not reporting the news fairly, not objectively.
More children have died in Iraq as a result of the United Nations economic sanctions than died in the nuclear blast of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's estimated today, as we are speaking, it's estimated by the United Nations that over 4,500 children are dying each month from hunger and disease. That's 4,500 children under the age of 5. The United Nations has said very plainly and clearly that these deaths are a direct result of economic sanctions. And the United States has a major role to play with those sanctions. The U.S. is heavily in support of economic sanctions against the people of Iraq, which have been in place for 7 years now. The Gulf War had an absolutely devastating effect on the country of Iraq. killed 100,000 or more people, totally devastated the entire infrastructure of the country. Sanctions have continued that war. And another 100,000 people, another 150,000 people are dying every year. The war with Iraq has never ended. The toll now is all civilians. And it's mounting daily. And it's nothing less, the economic sanctions placed by the United Nations is nothing less than a crime against all of humanity. It's devastating effect on the civilian population. Again, the United Nations, whose purpose, whose charter, is to protect civilian populations from the scourge of war, is instead waging war. And we have to ask why. And we have to ask why our country is supporting those sanctions.
Perhaps I'd like to address an issue that sometimes when we say this, people respond, sometimes our leaders respond by saying it's not the responsibility of the United States of America. And they say it's the responsibility of the regime of Iraq to comply with United Nations regulations, and then the sanctions could be lifted. The answer, I think, is quite clear. You cannot use the threat of starvation and denial of food or medicine against a civilian population to apply political pressure. You can't use that to coerce a foreign government. To do that actually is international terrorism. And that's the strict legal definition of the term. And so whatever responsibility may be assigned, or we may want, or whatever our opinion may be of the Iraqi regime, it's been our choice of weapons. We've chosen this weapon, which a lot of people, myself included, I have to say, agreed it to initially as a way of avoiding war, as a way of avoiding the violence of war. And now 10 times more people have died from this weapon of mass destruction as applied by the world government body, the United Nations, than died during the 45 days of the war itself. So this must be spoken about, because it's becoming a means of coercion and a weapon of choice, because it is not being noticed by people, and it needs to be noticed.
Yeah. I've been to Iraq 3 times in the last 11 months, each time in public violation of U.S. law. When Bert goes to Iraq, or I go to Iraq to deliver medicine to children who are dying of disease, because Iraq cannot import medicine, we risk 12 years in a United States federal prison. We risk over $1 million in fines, because it is against the law for us to bring medicine into the country of Iraq, again, to help children. Each time I return to Iraq, the last time was in June, I've seen conditions deteriorate. We've heard much about a oil for food deal, UN Resolution 986, which allows for $2 billion worth of oil to be exchanged for food and medicine. That is having very little impact on the population of Iraq. The majority of that money is being used to pay for UN costs, to pay for the cost of the upkeep of the oil pipelines, to pay for peacekeeping operations in northern Iraq. Only $800,000 is available for central and southern Iraq, or 25 cents per person per day. Before UN Resolution 986, let's say people in Iraq had enough food for 15 days. Now, people have enough food for 18 days, but they don't have enough. They don't have enough food. Conditions continue to deteriorate. People continue to die, and we need to ask, as the leader, the United States, as the leaders of the world, why we allow this to continue.
And what steps do you think need to be taken in order to stop these sanctions?
Oh, what it would take to stop the sanctions is really quite simple. Everybody, I think, agrees that if the United States were to take a position that sanctions would end, they would end. Now, just to make it clear to the audience, sanctions are not an arms embargo. Sanctions are a prohibition against doing any kind of business with the government and the resources of Iraq. Iraq cannot sell oil, and that needs to end. Iraq. One indication, by the way, which would be a very simple recommendation, for which I can find no objection whatsoever, is one thing that's come out of the United Nations Food for Oil Resolution 986, is that Iraq has agreed to the United Nations controlling all the monies that come from the sale of the oil under this resolution. And all of that money goes to a UN bank account. Now, the UN controls every expenditure down to the last penny of that money. What possible reason is there, justification is there for telling a country how much money it can spend for food and medicines when it's its own money? And you know you have control. None of the money can be spent for anything else, not even for fixing the water supplies, which desperately needs to be done. So here's a situation with a country of 20 million people that has the means of feeding themselves. You have strict control over the possible use of that resource, the sale of oils, and it can only be used for, we're not talking about steak and caviar, we're talking about millet and oil and very basic food groups, and antibiotics and aspirins, and they had a very first-class medical facility. What justification can there be? It's a question I ask people in New York who have been in contact with the State Department, and I think there's no answer to this, other than the very sad one. It's a piece of evidence that we are willing to use the suffering of the people of Iraq as a tool of political pressure. And if we're willing to do that, I'd like to make an argument which I think is a very real one for me. People may feel, that's far away. What does it concern me? It's thousands of miles away. It's not my concern. If we begin to treat people that far away with such callousness and indifference, and actually with such racial prejudice, it's because they're Arab people and they're Muslims that we could not allow like 125,000 Israeli children to die because Israel has weapons of mass destruction. Would we consider that an allowable alternative? Of course we wouldn't. We'll begin to treat ourselves, Americans, the same way. And I'm going to make a change of subject, but there's another issue related to this in which I'm afraid to say that I think there's serious evidence that we are doing that already. And that is we are treating the American soldiers who fought in the Gulf War with callousness, with indifference, with a regard for what it will cost us rather than with a regard for the human lives that are involved. And that is the issue of what is called generically Gulf War syndrome.
Could you describe that for us and the issues surrounding it?
Yes, exactly. Gulf War syndrome, as many people may know, is a general term used to describe the reports of many of the people who've served in the Gulf of varying degrees of physical illnesses that they've suffered since they've come back. Now, initially, I think it's fair to say that the initial military and U.S. government position about this was that this was either psychosomatic or imagined or not real illnesses, and it was pretty much dismissed and poo-pah'd. After many years of much work on the part of people who have been suffering from this, as I understand it, the Pentagon has been forced to treat more seriously the nature of these illnesses. And there have been investigations so that even a short time ago on the front page of the Seattle Times, there's now a report 6 years after the event of the Pentagon changing its assessment of how many U.S. troops were possibly affected by blowing up of chemical and biological facilities in Iraq. I'd be surprised if very many people in the audience really believe that we have been told the truth by people honestly trying to get to the root of what is the cause of these illnesses. Rather, I'm afraid that, like many people, we have come to hear one story revised again with more change, so that we're really very doubtful of what our own government is telling us. And this is about our own people now. Now, I would ask people to ask if they ever heard what are the consequences for the Iraqi people of our having blown up chemical and biological weapons. We hardly ever, we never hear of that in the newspapers. Are they not civilians? Do they not also have lives? Are they not affected by this? Well, okay. There's one aspect of that that needs to be spoken of here because it clearly has not been covered and is very likely, or at least it's one of the possible causes of Gulf War syndrome, and it has also changed the nature of the battlefield in Iraq. And that issue is the issue of depleted uranium weapons. And I'll need a moment to explain what that is. Weapons, either artillery shells fired or shells fired from tanks or from aircraft, have been tipped with a penetrator, it's called, made out of material which is, after it's been used for other purposes, is uranium, which is still radioactive. But it's not used for the purpose of radioactivity, it's used because of its material properties. That is, it's very hard and it's very dense. If you have something very hard and very dense, it makes an ideal tip on a bullet. And these were called silver bullets, by the way, in the military. This is not speculation, this is beyond question. And the number of rounds, I think it was 14,000 tank rounds and something close to 900,000 aircraft rounds fired from helicopters and airplanes, which were used to attack Iraqi armor. This has revolutionized the technology of warfare in the sense that there are reports of these, like tank shells, going through one side of a tank, out the other, and hitting another tank. That's how powerful and effective these are. From the point of view of the health of people on the battlefield, the primary danger doesn't lie from the radioactivity of these materials. It lies from the fact that when a projectile of this type with a depleted uranium tip strikes its target, a hard object, all of the energy has to go somewhere. And a lot of it goes into turning that depleted uranium into an aerosol, into very tiny particles, which then enter the entire environment, the air, the ground, and the water. And depleted uranium as particles, which can be ingested into the body, are toxic and carcinogenic. Those facts, all of the things I'm stating, are, I think, scientific facts beyond any question. The only question then becomes, to what effect has the ingestion of these particles, since this is the first time these weapons were used on a massive scale on a battlefield, been the cause or a contributing cause of Gulf War syndrome? And equally, one needs to ask, to what effect has this environmental pollution been the cause of the many repeated increasing instances of leukemia and cancers among the people of Iraq, particularly the children that Rick and I saw when we were there? So people need to know this, and we need to ask the very simple question, why don't we know this? What is happening to our media if we don't know 1 million deaths happening in the country that's reported not only by the UN but by New England Journal of Medicine, the Lancet Medical Journal? And why is it we don't know about depleted uranium when these are facts that are available? And you're going to display, you said, a number, so people that are concerned about this can contact the number and we can give you more information, because nobody should take this on faith or that we're saying it. And please, there is documentation. We believe that the truth of this matter on both the issue of sanctions and on the weaponry involved is our most important ally. So please inquire about the truth.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Did you have any last comments?
Just the war with Iraq ended nearly 7 years ago. When the war with Japan, the war with Germany ended, we marshaled in a Marshall Plan. We helped rebuild the societies. What we've seen in Iraq is, although the ground war ended again, the war hasn't, and the casualties mount. Why?
Well, thank you very much for the work that you're doing.